Good evening. Tonight we're standing in a university auditorium in Kazakhstan as ancient dreams collide with modern ambitions. What we imagine as progress marching inevitably forward was actually history folding back on itself like silk threads, rewoven into new patterns. Just a story of presidential speeches, construction sites across 3 continents, and diplomatic chess games. And the realization that every road leads both toward connection and controversy. If you find wonder in these explorations of how the past shapes our present, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. Drop a comment about whether you see the Belt and Road as revival or reinvention. There's something fascinating about knowing we're all witnessing history being written in real time. So dim the lights. Let's begin with Xi Jinping stepping to a podium in Astana. Autumn light streaming through glass as he prepares to announce something that would reshape the world's economic geography. Chapter 11. Modern Legacy. From the Silk Road to the Belt and Road Initiative. In the golden autumn light of Astana, Kazakhstan, beneath the soaring glass dome of Nazarbayev University, hundreds of students and dignitaries gather in hushed anticipation. The crisp September air carries promises that seem to echo across centuries, much like it had when caravans first crossed these same Central Asian steppes, their bells chiming across the vast grasslands as merchants carried silk and dreams between distant worlds. Chinese President Xi Jinping steps to the podium, his words about to ripple across continents and through time, connecting the aspirations of ancient traders to the ambitions of a modern superpower. Around him, the university's contemporary architecture rises from soil that has witnessed the passage of countless civilizations, Turkic horsemen, Mongol armies, Russian explorers, Soviet planners, and now the architects of Kazakhstan's independent future. 2,000 years ago, Xi begins, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated history. The Chinese envoy, Zhang Qian, journeyed west and opened an overland route linking the east and west. Today, as we review this history, we can appreciate the vision of our forebears. The audience leans forward as he paints images of caravans laden with precious silk traversing these very lands, of merchants and scholars carrying not just goods but the seeds of civilizations across the vast Eurasian continent. But this September day in 2013 offers more than historical reflection. Xi's eyes sweep across the young faces before him, Kazakhs with their nomadic heritage, Russians carrying Soviet memories, Chinese students pursuing distant dreams, scholars from across Central Asia, as he unveils something unprecedented. We should take an innovative approach and jointly build an economic belt along the Silk Road. The phrase hangs in the air like morning mist over the steppes, heavy with possibility. An economic belt. A new Silk Road. The ancient pathways of commerce and culture, reimagined for the 21st century. The moment captures profound ambition, wrapped in historical reverence. Here, in the heart of Central Asia where East truly meets West, where winds still whisper tales of Marco Polo and Zhangqian, where the northern lights sometimes dance above landscapes that have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, a modern vision takes shape. The university itself, gleaming with contemporary glass and steel, yet rooted in soil where countless caravans once rested, embodies this bridging of eras. Around the auditorium, faces reflect the diversity that once characterized the great trading cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. These students understand, perhaps better than anyone, what it means to live at the crossroads of civilizations. Their ancestors welcomed merchants from Constantinople and Chang'an. Their cities housed Christians and Muslims, Buddhists and Zoroastrians, Manichaeans and Jews. Now they listen as Xi speaks of policy coordination, facilities connectivity, unimpeded trade, financial integration, and people-to-people bonds. Concepts that would have been perfectly comprehensible to a medieval Sogdian trader counting silver coins in a Tashkent bazaar. Outside the university walls, Kazakhstan's new capital rises from the steppe, a symbol of post-Soviet ambition and Central Asian Renaissance. The Bayturuk Tower pierces the sky like a modern minaret, while the Khan Shatir Entertainment Center curves like a giant yurt, reimagined in glass and steel. The country's vast oil reserves and mineral wealth represent contemporary versions of the precious commodities that once drew merchants across treacherous mountain passes and scorching deserts. The Kazakhs in the audience understand their geography grants them the same strategic importance their ancestors possessed. They remain the bridge between China's rising economy and Europe's established markets. As Xi concludes his speech, autumn sunlight streams through the university's windows, illuminating faces that reflect the same mixture of curiosity and calculation that must have characterized merchants in ancient Samarkand's covered markets. The applause that follows carries more than diplomatic politeness. It resonates with recognition that something significant has just been born, something that will reshape the world's economic geography as surely as the original Silk Road reshaped the ancient world. The echo of ancient routes. As word of China's grand vision spread from capital to capital, something remarkable began to happen. The same magnetic pull that had once drawn merchants to Samarkand's bazaars now attracted nations to Beijing's promise of connectivity. Within weeks of Xi's Kazakhstan speech, invitations flowed to Beijing from across the developing world. Presidents and prime ministers who had struggled to secure infrastructure funding from traditional sources suddenly found themselves welcomed in the Zhongnanhai compound, where Chinese leaders spoke of railways and ports, power plants and pipelines, with the casual confidence of a civilization that had been building such things for millennia. The vision expanded with breathtaking speed. In October 2013, just 1 month after the Astana speech, Xi stood before the Indonesian parliament in Jakarta, where tropical humidity and the scent of frangipani flowers filled the air. Here, surrounded by representatives of the world's largest archipelago nation, he unveiled the maritime dimension of his grand strategy, the 21st century maritime Silk Road. Like the ancient sea routes that had connected Guangzhou to Malacca, Colombo to Hormuz and Alexandria to Venice, this new maritime network would bind together the Indian Ocean world. Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono listened with particular interest. His country's 17,000 islands had long served as stepping stones between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, their ports welcoming Arab dhows, Chinese junks, and European galleons across the centuries. The prospect of renewed Chinese investment in Indonesia's maritime infrastructure awakened memories of the Majapahit and Srivijaya empires, when Indonesian rulers commanded the sea lanes between China and India. In dusty Jakarta archives lay Portuguese maps from the 16th century, marking Indonesian ports as essential waypoints on the Rota de China, the China route that had made Lisbon wealthy beyond its founders' dreams. The response exceeded all expectations. By early 2014, Chinese diplomatic missions found themselves inundated with requests for infrastructure projects. In Pakistan, where summer heat shimmers off the Thar Desert and monsoon rains flood the Indus Plains, government officials spoke excitedly of connecting the Arabian Sea port of Gwadar to the western Chinese city of Kashgar, a distance of over 3,000 kilometers that would require tunneling through the Karakoram Mountains and crossing some of Earth's most challenging terrain. The route would slash thousands of nautical miles from China's energy imports, avoiding the vulnerable choke point of the Malacca Strait, where American naval power could potentially strangle Chinese commerce. In the glass towers of Colombo, Sri Lankan officials examined plans for expanding their Indian Ocean ports. In the mountain ring capital of Nepal, Kathmandu, ministers dreamed of railways connecting their landlocked kingdom to the sea. In the Red Sea port of Djibouti, where French colonial buildings bake under the African sun, officials calculated how Chinese investment might transform their strategic location at the mouth of the Suez Canal into a modern commercial empire. The scale of Chinese ambition became clear with the establishment of new financial institutions designed specifically to fund this modern Silk Road. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, announced in October 2013, represented something unprecedented: a Chinese-led multilateral development bank that could compete with the World Bank and Asian Development Bank. Despite initial skepticism from Washington, which urged allies to avoid joining, the AIIB attracted 57 founding members by 2015, including traditional American allies like the United Kingdom, Germany, and Australia. The Silk Road Fund, established in December 2014 with $40 billion in initial capital, provided another financing mechanism. Unlike traditional development banks focused on poverty reduction and social programs, these new institutions prioritized infrastructure: roads, railways, ports, power plants, pipelines, and telecommunications networks. They embodied a distinctly Chinese approach to development: build the physical foundations of prosperity, and economic growth will follow. The first major project to emerge from this institutional framework was the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, announced in April 2015, with fanfare that rivaled the signing of historic treaties. Pakistani Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and Xi Jinping affixed their signatures to 51 agreements worth $46 billion, an amount equivalent to all foreign investment in Pakistan since 1970. The ceremony took place in Islamabad's Spring Gardens, where rose petals floated in marble fountains and the air carried the fragrance of jasmine. Pakistani children waved small Chinese and Pakistani flags as their parents contemplated a future where Gwadar might become the Rotterdam of the Arabian Sea. The enthusiasm was infectious. In Kazakhstan, President Nursultan Nazarbayev announced plans to connect his country's railway network to Chinese lines, creating a new Silk Road for freight trains carrying goods between Chinese factories and European markets. In Belarus, President Alexander Lukashenko spoke of his country becoming the, quote, gateway between China and Europe, hosting massive Chinese industrial parks near Minsk. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán welcomed Chinese investment in a high-speed railway connecting Budapest to Belgrade, despite European Union concerns about Chinese influence in Eastern Europe. The revival carried profound historical resonance. In Samarkand, where Tamerlane once held court and Babur dreamed of Indian conquests, Uzbek officials pointed to ancient trade routes as justification for new Chinese-funded highways. In Venice, where Marco Polo's family palace still stands near the Rialto Bridge, Italian mayors spoke of their city's historical role as Europe's gateway to Asia. The Hungarian railway project would pass near the ancient Roman city of Sirmium, where emperors once governed the Eastern Empire, and where medieval merchants had loaded Balkan silver onto wagons bound for Constantinople. The Great Construction. The transformation from diplomatic speeches to concrete reality began with remarkable speed. By 2016, the sound of construction equipment echoed across 3 continents as the Belt and Road Initiative shifted from vision to implementation. In Lahore, Pakistan's cultural capital, where Mughal emperors once built gardens that seemed like earthly paradises, Pakistani workers and Chinese engineers collaborated on something the city had never seen: a metro system with air-conditioned cars that glided silently above traffic-choked streets. The Orange Line metro became a symbol of what the new Silk Road could achieve. For centuries, Lahore's residents had navigated the city much as their ancestors had, on foot, by horse and cart, later by bicycle and crowded buses that belched black smoke into the Punjab sun. The metro's 27 stations, designed with Islamic architectural motifs that honored local traditions while employing Chinese engineering expertise, represented a fusion of civilizations. Pakistani mothers now board sleek trains with their children, traveling distances that once required hours of struggle through chaotic traffic. The journey from Dera Gujran to Ali Town, past the Badshahi Mosque where Aurangzeb once prayed, takes just 45 minutes instead of the traditional 2 hours. In the Indonesian highlands between Jakarta and Bandung, an even more ambitious project took shape. Indonesian workers, many descended from Javanese princes and Chinese merchants, cleared tropical forests and terraced mountainsides to create Southeast Asia's first high-speed railway. The engineering challenges rivaled those faced by the builders of the Trans-Siberian Railway, 142 kilometers of track, requiring 13 tunnels and 62 bridges, designed to withstand Indonesia's frequent earthquakes while maintaining speeds of 350 kilometers per hour. The railway's inauguration in October 2023 became a celebration of technological achievement and cultural synthesis. Indonesian President Joko Widodo, known as Jokowi, rode alongside Chinese officials on the inaugural journey, watching as rural Indonesian landscapes blurred past the windows at unprecedented speeds. Villages that had remained isolated since Dutch colonial times now found themselves connected to the global economy. The journey from Jakarta to Bandung, which had required over 3 hours of driving through mountain roads, was reduced to 45 minutes of comfortable travel in carriages that seemed to float above the rails. The transformation was perhaps most dramatic in Piraeus, the port that had served Athens since the time of Pericles. When the global financial crisis devastated Greece's economy, Piraeus had become a symbol of European decline, its cranes idle, its terminals empty, its workers facing unemployment. Chinese shipping giant COSCO acquired a controlling stake in 2016 and immediately began implementing the operational expertise that had made Chinese ports the world's most efficient. The revival seemed almost miraculous. Greek dockworkers who had feared for their jobs found themselves working alongside Chinese managers who spoke pidgin Greek and shared their lunches of rice and olives. Automated cranes began moving containers with precision that European observers had thought impossible. Within 3 years, Piraeus became the fastest-growing container port in the world, its throughput increasing by over 300%. The port that had once welcomed Phoenician traders and Roman grain ships now served as the Mediterranean terminus for trains carrying Chinese goods across the Eurasian landmass. Chinese investment transformed the Piraeus experience for everyone involved. Greek longshoremen discovered that Chinese managers, despite communication barriers, shared their concerns about safety and efficiency. The Chinese introduced tea breaks alongside traditional Greek coffee breaks, and gradually the port developed its own hybrid culture. Greek workers performing traditional dances at Chinese New Year celebrations. Chinese managers learning to appreciate ouzo and octopus. The success attracted other European ports to seek Chinese investment, from Bilbao in Spain to Antwerp in Belgium. In the East African port of Mombasa, where Arab dhows had once loaded ivory and slaves for Indian Ocean markets, Chinese engineers supervised the construction of a modern railway that would connect the Kenyan coast to the capital Nairobi and eventually to landlocked Uganda. The standard gauge railway, inaugurated in 2017, reduced the journey from Mombasa to Nairobi from 12 hours to 4 hours and 30 minutes. Kenyan passengers, many wearing traditional kanga cloth that displayed Chinese-made designs, marveled at crossing landscapes that had challenged European explorers for centuries. The Savo Plains, where lions had terrorized Indian railroad workers in the 1890s, now traversed by air-conditioned cars filled with Kenyan businesspeople checking their smartphones. The railway's impact extended far beyond transportation. Small towns along the route experienced economic booms as increased connectivity attracted investment. Kenyan entrepreneurs established new businesses catering to railway workers and passengers. Local farmers gained access to Nairobi markets that had previously been unreachable. The railway created over 40,000 jobs for Kenyans, from station masters fluent in Mandarin to conductors who learned to announce stops in Swahili, English, and Chinese. In Central Asia, where winter temperatures can drop to -40 degrees Celsius and summer heat exceeds 50 degrees Celsius, Chinese workers and local crews collaborated on pipelines that would carry natural gas from Turkmenistan's Karakum Desert to Chinese cities thousands of kilometers away. The engineering challenges required solutions that Marco Polo could never have imagined. Pipelines buried beneath shifting sands, pumping stations powered by solar panels in landscapes where ancient caravans had struggled to find water, compressor stations designed to withstand earthquakes in regions where the Silk Road had been repeatedly severed by geological instability. The human dimension of these projects proved as remarkable as their technical achievements. In Pakistan, Chinese engineers learned to appreciate the 5 daily prayers that structured their Muslim colleagues' work schedules. Pakistani workers discovered that Chinese New Year celebrations, with their emphasis on family reunion and shared meals, resonated with their own cultural values. In Sri Lanka, Chinese construction workers visited Buddhist temples alongside their Sinhalese colleagues, lighting incense and offering prayers for project success. In Ethiopia, Chinese managers adapted to the Orthodox calendar, while Ethiopian workers learned to prepare simple Chinese dishes for their new colleagues. These cross-cultural exchanges generated their own innovations. Pakistani construction techniques, adapted to extreme heat and monsoon flooding, influenced Chinese engineering practices. Sri Lankan workers introduced Chinese colleagues to traditional Ayurvedic medicine, while Chinese workers shared acupuncture techniques. In Kenya, fusion cuisines emerged as Chinese chefs adapted their techniques to local ingredients. Ugali prepared with Chinese vegetables, Chinese noodles made with Kenyan wheat, tea ceremonies that blended Chinese traditions with Kenyan chai culture. Crossroads of cooperation and controversy. Yet, as construction crews worked across 3 continents, and the first BRI freight trains crossed the Eurasian landmass, questions began to arise about the true nature of this modern Silk Road. The very success of Chinese projects sparked debates that echoed ancient concerns about foreign influence and local autonomy. In universities from Harvard to Oxford, in think tanks from Washington to Delhi, scholars and policymakers began examining whether China's benevolent rhetoric masked more calculated ambitions. The controversy crystallized around Sri Lanka's Hambantota port, where the blue waters of the Indian Ocean lap against shores that had welcomed Portuguese galleons, Dutch merchant ships, and British steamers across the centuries. The port story became a cautionary tale about the potential dangers of Chinese financing, yet the reality proved more complex than initial headlines suggested. The project had originated not with Chinese ambitions, but with Sri Lankan dreams. President Mahinda Rajapaksa, scion of a powerful political family from Hambantota district, envisioned transforming his remote hometown into a major Indian Ocean port. The location held both promise and peril, far from Colombo's congested harbor, but isolated from existing transportation networks, blessed with deep natural waters, but lacking the hinterland connections that drive port profitability. Chinese companies, led by China Harbor Engineering Group, enthusiastically supported Rajapaksa's vision. They conducted feasibility studies that painted optimistic pictures of Hambantota's potential, perhaps influenced more by commercial opportunities than sober economic analysis. The resulting contracts reflected this optimism. Sri Lanka borrowed $1.4 billion from Chinese banks to build a port designed to handle the world's largest container ships, despite limited evidence that such vessels would choose Hambantota over established regional hubs like Singapore or Dubai. The port's magnificent infrastructure, concrete piers stretching into the Indian Ocean, cranes capable of lifting the heaviest containers, terminals designed to accommodate thousands of trucks, stood largely empty when it opened in 2010. Ships that were supposed to call at Hambantota continued their journeys to more established ports. The anticipated economic development failed to materialize. Sri Lanka struggled to service the loans, especially as global commodity prices affected the country's traditional tea and rubber exports. The resolution came in 2017, when Sri Lanka agreed to lease the port to Chinese state-owned China Merchants Port Holdings for 99 years, in exchange for debt relief worth $1.1 billion. Critics immediately labeled this debt trap diplomacy, a Chinese strategy of lending money for unsustainable projects, then seizing strategic assets when countries defaulted. The phrase resonated globally, appearing in newspapers from London to Tokyo, in congressional hearings in Washington, and in academic conferences worldwide. Yet closer examination revealed a more nuanced story. The Sri Lankan government, not Chinese officials, had initiated the port project. Chinese companies had responded to Sri Lankan requests for financing and construction, motivated primarily by commercial rather than strategic considerations. When the project struggled, China faced the same dilemma that confronts any major creditor: how to recover investments without destroying relationships with important partners. The lease arrangement, while unprecedented in its duration, allowed Sri Lanka to retain ownership of the port while benefiting from Chinese operational expertise. Sri Lankan port workers kept their jobs, often with improved working conditions under Chinese management. The port began attracting more shipping traffic as Chinese operations improved efficiency and reduced costs. Local businesses in Hambantota district experienced modest growth as increased port activity generated demand for services. Similar complexities emerged in Malaysia, where the East Coast Rail Link became another flashpoint in debates about Chinese intentions. The 688-kilometer railway, designed to connect Malaysia's east and west coasts, promised to reduce transportation costs and stimulate economic development in the country's less prosperous eastern states. The project carried deep political significance for former Prime Minister Najib Razak, whose ruling party relied heavily on rural Malay voters who would benefit from improved connectivity. Chinese contractors, led by China Communications Construction Company, offered attractive financing terms, $20 billion in loans at favorable interest rates, with much of the construction work reserved for Chinese companies and workers. The agreement reflected China's standard approach to BRI projects, package deals that combined financing, construction and operation under Chinese management, ensuring efficiency but limiting local participation in high-skilled positions. The project became controversial when opposition leader Mahathir Mohamad criticized it as excessively expensive and potentially compromising Malaysian sovereignty. After winning the 2018 election at age 92, Mahathir temporarily suspended the railway, citing Malaysia's debt burden and concerns about Chinese influence. The suspension sent shockwaves through BRI planning offices in Beijing, where officials had assumed that signed agreements would ensure project completion regardless of political changes. The eventual resolution demonstrated the pragmatic flexibility that characterized many BRI adjustments. After extended negotiations, Malaysia and China agreed to reduce the project's cost from $20 billion to $15.7 billion, while maintaining its essential scope. Chinese contractors accepted lower profit margins in exchange for project continuation. Malaysian officials gained greater oversight of construction standards and local hiring practices. The compromise satisfied neither critics nor enthusiasts completely, but it preserved the relationship between China and one of Southeast Asia's most important economies. The complexity of managing BRI projects across diverse political systems became even more apparent in Italy, where the decision to join the initiative sparked debates that reflected broader European anxieties about Chinese influence. Italy's participation represented a diplomatic coup for China, the first G7 nation to formally endorse the BRI, lending credibility to Chinese claims about the initiative's global appeal. The Italian decision emerged from a combination of economic necessity and political calculation. Italy's economy had struggled since the 2008 financial crisis, with youth unemployment exceeding 30% in southern regions and infrastructure investment lagging behind European averages. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte's populist government, facing pressure to stimulate growth while managing EU fiscal constraints, saw Chinese investment as a potential solution to structural economic problems. The signing ceremony at Via Madama in March 2019 captured the historical resonance of Italy's decision. The Renaissance villa, built by Pope Clement VII and designed by Raphael, had witnessed centuries of diplomatic negotiations. Now it hosted the signature of memorandums that would revive trade relationships, dating back to Marco Polo's adventures. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Italian Prime Minister Conte exchanged documents worth $2.8 billion in initial agreements, covering port development, telecommunications infrastructure, and cultural exchanges. The European reaction was swift and harsh. EU officials warned that Italy was undermining European unity and potentially compromising security by allowing Chinese companies access to sensitive infrastructure. The United States expressed similar concerns, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo cautioning that Chinese investment often came with hidden costs and strategic obligations. France and Germany, while maintaining diplomatic courtesy, clearly disapproved of Italy's unilateral decision to engage with China outside EU frameworks. Italian supporters of BRI participation argued that their country was simply reclaiming its historical role as Europe's gateway to Asia. Venice had grown wealthy by connecting European markets to Asian goods. Genoa had financed Columbus's westward journey to find a new route to China. Modern Italy could benefit similarly by becoming China's primary European partner. Chinese investment in Trieste port and other infrastructure projects could revitalize Italy's economy, while positioning the country advantageously for 21st-century global trade. Critics worried that Italian enthusiasm for Chinese investment reflected short-term thinking about long-term strategic relationships. European integration had been based on shared values and mutual oversight. Chinese investment came with fewer strings attached but potentially greater long-term obligations. The debate reflected broader European struggles to balance economic opportunities with security concerns, national sovereignty with supranational coordination. Resilience and recalibration. Then came 2020, and with it, a global pandemic that tested every assumption about connectivity, trade, and international cooperation. The virus that emerged in Wuhan, a central Chinese city connected to the world through high-speed rail networks and international airports, spread along the same routes that carry Belt and Road commerce. Within weeks, the disease reached every BRI partner country, forcing lockdowns that halted construction projects and interrupted supply chains. The pandemic initially seemed to threaten the entire BRI concept. International travel restrictions prevented Chinese workers from reaching project sites. Supply chain disruptions delayed delivery of Chinese-manufactured components. European ports that had been receiving increasing volumes of Chinese goods via BRI rail connections suddenly found their terminals empty, as factories closed and consumer demand collapsed. Yet the crisis also demonstrated the initiative's adaptability and revealed new dimensions of Chinese global engagement. As Western countries struggled to produce adequate medical supplies, China's industrial capacity became a lifeline for hospitals worldwide. The Health Silk Road emerged as Chinese planes and trains carried masks, ventilators, and vaccines along BRI routes to partner countries that might otherwise have been overlooked by wealthier nations focused on securing supplies for their own populations. In Pakistan, where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor had already improved transportation infrastructure, Chinese medical supplies reached Islamabad within days of being requested. The same highways that carried Chinese goods to Gwadar port now carried emergency medical equipment to Pakistani hospitals. Pakistani doctors received telemedicine training from Chinese colleagues via fiber optic networks installed under BRI telecommunications projects. The health crisis deepened practical cooperation between Chinese and Pakistani medical professionals in ways that economic partnerships alone might not have achieved. In Central Asia, where winter temperatures and geographic isolation had historically made medical supplies scarce, Chinese vaccines arrived via the rail networks that connected Xinjiang to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and beyond. The trains that normally carried manufactured goods now carried hope in the form of Sinovac and Sinopharm vaccines, distributed free to populations that might otherwise have waited years for Western-produced alternatives. The pandemic also accelerated digital dimensions of BRI cooperation that had previously received less attention than physical infrastructure. With international travel severely restricted, Chinese companies and their international partners relied increasingly on digital communications, e-commerce platforms, and remote collaboration tools. The fiber optic cables that China had installed across Central Asia and Africa suddenly became essential infrastructure for maintaining international commerce and cooperation. In Africa, where Chinese companies had built telecommunications networks connecting capitals to rural areas, the digital infrastructure proved crucial for distance learning and telemedicine during lockdowns. Students in remote Ethiopian villages could access online education through Chinese-built networks. Patients in rural Kenya could consult with doctors in Nairobi via telecommunication systems installed under BRI programs. The crisis highlighted how infrastructure investments made for commercial purposes could serve humanitarian needs when circumstances required. The pandemic period also witnessed a subtle but significant shift in Chinese approach to BRI implementation. The massive megaprojects that had characterized the initiative's early years, multi-billion-dollar ports, transcontinental railways, giant hydroelectric dams, gave way to smaller, more targeted investments that better addressed local needs. Chinese officials began speaking about small and beautiful projects that could be completed quickly and generate immediate benefits for local populations. This recalibration reflected lessons learned from early BRI experiences. Large infrastructure projects, while impressive and strategically important, often took years to complete and generate benefits primarily for international trade rather than local development. Smaller projects, rural electrification, telecommunications networks, agricultural processing facilities, healthcare clinics, could be completed more quickly and create immediate improvements in local living standards. In Laos, Chinese companies shifted focus from the massive high-speed railway connecting China to Vientiane towards smaller projects that improved rural connectivity and agricultural productivity. Solar panels manufactured in China brought electricity to villages that had never been connected to power grids. Chinese agricultural advisors worked with Lao farmers to improve rice yields and develop new crop varieties suitable for changing climate conditions. In Africa, Chinese companies increasingly emphasized projects that could be managed and maintained by local personnel. Instead of building giant infrastructure projects that required Chinese technicians for ongoing operation, they focused on training African engineers and managers to run telecommunications networks, operate mining equipment, and maintain transportation systems. This approach created more sustainable partnerships while reducing Chinese operational costs and responsibilities. The adjustment reflected broader changes in China's global position and domestic priorities. China's economy, while still growing, no longer generated the massive capital surpluses that had funded early BRI expansion. Chinese companies faced increasing domestic infrastructure needs as the country's urban population continued to grow and age. Environmental concerns, largely ignored in the initiative's early years, became more prominent as climate change affected China's own development planning. Italy's departure from the BRI in 2023 symbolized both the initiative's maturation and the persistent challenges of managing international partnerships across different political systems. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's decision not to renew Italy's Memorandum of Understanding reflected her government's emphasis on strengthening Atlantic relationships and addressing European concerns about Chinese influence. The Italian withdrawal, while diplomatically awkward for China, had minimal practical impact on bilateral trade and investment. Chinese companies continued operating Italian facilities they had acquired before 2019. Italian exports to China, while not reaching the dramatic increases that BRI supporters had predicted, maintained steady growth. The relationship demonstrated that economic cooperation could continue without formal political frameworks, though perhaps with less symbolic significance and fewer grand strategic ambitions. By the initiative's 10th anniversary in 2023, a more mature and realistic assessment had emerged of what the Belt and Road could and could not achieve. The grand vision of seamlessly connecting 3 continents through Chinese finance infrastructure had given way to a more modest but sustainable approach, focused on practical cooperation in areas where Chinese capabilities matched partner country needs. Continuing legacies. As the Belt and Road Initiative entered its second decade, the questions facing its architects proved remarkably similar to those that had confronted the merchants and empires of the ancient Silk Road. How do you sustain cooperation across cultures? How do you balance local interests with global ambitions? How do you maintain trust in an interconnected world where economic relationships inevitably carry political implications? The modern answers, like their historical predecessors, emerged through practical experience rather than theoretical planning. In Pakistan, where the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor had become the BRI's most substantial single investment, the relationship evolved into something more complex than either partner had initially envisioned. Chinese companies discovered that successful operation in Pakistan required understanding local customs, religious practices, and political sensitivities. Pakistani officials learned that Chinese efficiency could coexist with local traditions if both sides approached cooperation with mutual respect rather than rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The Orange Line Metro in Lahore provided a tangible example of how ancient principles of cultural exchange could operate in modern contexts. Pakistani women who had rarely ventured far from their neighborhoods now traveled daily to jobs in distant parts of the city, wearing traditional shalwar kameez while reading Chinese-language signs that announced stations in Urdu, English, and Mandarin. Chinese engineers learned to schedule maintenance around Islamic prayer times, while Pakistani workers taught their Chinese colleagues to appreciate the subtle flavors of Lahori tea and the complex social protocols that govern interactions in Punjab society. The cultural exchanges generated by these practical collaborations often proved more lasting than the infrastructure projects themselves. Pakistani students who learned Mandarin to work on BRI projects continued their Chinese studies long after construction ended, creating a generation of Pakistan-China cultural bridges. Chinese workers who mastered Urdu phrases and developed tastes for Pakistani cuisine maintained friendships with local colleagues that transcended their official assignments. These personal connections, multiplied across dozens of countries and hundreds of projects, created informal networks that paralleled the formal diplomatic and commercial relationships. In Central Asia, where the ancient Silk Road had facilitated the greatest cultural exchanges in human history, modern BRI projects revived traditions of adaptation and synthesis that had lain dormant during decades of Soviet isolation. Uzbek craftsmen who learned Chinese metalworking techniques adapted them to traditional Islamic geometric patterns, creating hybrid artistic styles that honored both traditions. Chinese telecommunications engineers working in Kazakhstan discovered that nomadic herders had developed sophisticated informal communication networks that could inform modern mobile technology deployment. Kyrgyz musicians incorporated Chinese melodic elements into traditional epic songs, creating new forms that preserved ancient narratives while embracing contemporary influences. The academic and cultural programs that accompanied BRI infrastructure investments often generated the most profound long-term impacts. The Confucius Institutes established in partner countries introduced millions of students to Chinese language and culture, but they also created platforms for dialogue about educational methods, philosophical traditions, and approaches to social development. Chinese students studying in Belt and Road countries returned home with expanded perspectives on Islam, Christianity, African traditional religions, and indigenous knowledge systems that enriched Chinese understanding of global diversity. The Silk Road International Library Alliance, launched as a complement to physical infrastructure development, connected over 400 libraries across BRI countries, enabling sharing of digital resources and collaborative preservation of cultural heritage. Librarians in Tashkent could access Chinese historical documents, while researchers in Beijing gained access to Persian manuscripts preserved in Iranian collections. The program embodied the ancient Silk Road principle that knowledge, like silk and spices, becomes more valuable when shared across cultural boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, the Belt and Road Initiative demonstrated that globalization in the 21st century could take forms different from the Western-dominated models that had prevailed since the Industrial Revolution. Where previous waves of global integration had typically involved dominant powers imposing their economic and political systems on weaker societies, the BRI offered a template for cooperation that emphasized infrastructure development over institutional reform, practical collaboration over ideological alignment. This approach reflected distinctly Chinese philosophical traditions that prioritized harmony and mutual benefit over competition and dominance. The concept of win-win cooperation that Chinese officials constantly invoked might have sounded like diplomatic boilerplate to Western ears, but it reflected genuine Chinese beliefs about sustainable international relationships. Chinese leaders, shaped by their country's historical experiences of foreign domination and exploitation, sought to create international partnerships that avoided the zero-sum calculations that had characterized colonial and Cold War relationships. The results, while imperfect, offered hope for more equitable forms of global development. African countries that had been largely ignored by Western investors, except as sources of raw materials, found Chinese partners willing to invest in value-added processing and manufacturing. Central Asian nations that had been treated as peripheral to European and American strategic calculations discovered that their geographic position made them central to Chinese development plans. Southeast Asian countries that had been pressured to choose between American and Chinese spheres of influence found opportunities to benefit from both relationships without sacrificing their sovereignty to either. The environmental dimensions of BRI development, initially overlooked in the enthusiasm for rapid construction, gradually received greater attention as climate change concerns intensified and partner countries demanded more sustainable approaches. Chinese companies that had built coal-fired power plants in Southeast Asia began shifting toward solar and wind projects as renewable energy costs declined and environmental awareness increased. The Green Belt and Road Initiative, launched in 2019, committed Chinese investors to environmental impact assessments and local consultation processes that had been absent from earlier projects. These adjustments reflected the initiative's essential pragmatism, its willingness to adapt to changing circumstances rather than rigidly adhering to initial plans. Like the ancient Silk Road, which had survived for centuries by constantly evolving in response to political changes, technological innovations, and shifting economic conditions, the modern Belt and Road demonstrated resilience through flexibility. As 2024 began, the initiative faced challenges that its founders could not have anticipated when Xi Jinping delivered his visionary speech in Kazakhstan over a decade earlier. Geopolitical tensions between China and the United States had intensified, forcing partner countries to navigate increasingly complex choices about technology adoption, supply chain management, and security cooperation. Climate change had made some BRI routes less reliable. Drought affecting Central Asian rivers that powered hydroelectric plants, rising sea levels threatening coastal infrastructure in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, extreme weather events disrupting transportation networks from Pakistan to Poland. Yet the fundamental appeal of the Belt and Road, its promise of improved connectivity, enhanced prosperity, and respectful cooperation among diverse societies, continued to resonate with developing countries that lacked alternative sources of infrastructure investment. The ancient Silk Road had endured similar challenges across its 500-year history, adapting to the rise and fall of empires, the spread of new religions, the devastation of pandemics, and the discovery of alternative trade routes. Its modern successor showed similar adaptability, suggesting that the human desire for connection and mutual benefit remained as powerful in the 21st century as it had been in the time of Zhang Qian and Marco Polo. The story of the Belt and Road Initiative thus represents more than contemporary geopolitics or economic development. It embodies humanity's persistent efforts to bridge differences, share knowledge, and create prosperity through cooperation rather than conquest. Like the ancient Silk Road merchants who learned to navigate cultural differences while pursuing mutual benefit, modern BRI participants discover that successful cooperation requires patience, adaptability, and genuine respect for local traditions and concerns. The initiative's legacy will ultimately be measured not by the number of kilometers of railway constructed or the volume of trade facilitated, but by its contribution to a more connected and cooperative world. In an era when nationalism and isolationism threaten international cooperation, the Belt and Road Initiative offers evidence that countries with different political systems, religious traditions, and economic structures can work together on shared challenges. The fiber optic cables stretching across Central Asia, the container ships calling at upgraded African ports, and the high-speed trains crossing Indonesian mountains, all serve as physical manifestations of humanity's capacity for collaboration. Threads across time. In the bustling ports of Piraeus and Colombo, in the quiet mountain valleys where new railways pierce ancient landscapes, in the offices of Nairobi and Almaty, where young professionals speak fluent Mandarin while preserving their own cultural identities, the spirit of the ancient Silk Road lives on. The caravanserai have been replaced by logistics centers, the merchant guilds by international corporations, the camel trains by container ships and freight railways. Yet the essential human impulse remains unchanged, the desire to connect, to trade, to learn from distant neighbors, and to build prosperity through peaceful exchange. The merchants who once gathered in Samarkand's Registan, speaking dozens of languages and practicing multiple faiths while conducting business with remarkable efficiency, would recognize much about the modern Belt and Road Initiative. They would understand the complex negotiations required to move goods across multiple jurisdictions, the need to adapt to local customs and regulations, the importance of building trust through repeated interactions, and the mutual benefits that arise when different societies pool their knowledge and resources. They would also recognize the challenges, the difficulty of maintaining cooperation across vast distances and diverse cultures, the temptation for powerful actors to dominate rather than collaborate, the need to balance local interests with global opportunities, and the constant requirement to adapt to changing political and economic circumstances. The ancient Silk Road succeeded for over a millennium, because its participants learned to navigate these challenges through practical experience, patient negotiation, and mutual respect. The modern Belt and Road Initiative faces the same requirements for success. As the sun sets over Gwadar Port, where Pakistani and Chinese workers share evening prayers before returning to their families, as morning light illuminates the Kenyan savannah where a new railway carries passengers who once could only dream of such speed and comfort, as students in Astana practice calligraphy that writes both Kazakh and Chinese characters with equal beauty, the ancient and modern Silk Roads converge in moments of quiet human connection. The great caravans no longer cross the Central Asian steppes, their bells ringing across the grasslands as merchants carry silk and dreams between distant civilizations. But their spirit endures in every container that crosses 3 continents by rail, every fiber optic cable that carries voices and data across the Eurasian landmass, every partnership between peoples who discover that their differences can be sources of strength rather than division. The Belt and Road Initiative, like the ancient Silk Road before it, ultimately represents humanity's refusal to accept the limitations imposed by geography, politics, or cultural differences. It embodies the persistent human conviction that cooperation serves us better than conflict, that prosperity shared is prosperity multiplied, and that the path to the future, like the path to distant markets, is best traveled together. In this way, the modern initiative honors the deepest traditions of the ancient Silk Road, while adapting them to contemporary needs and possibilities. Whether carried by camel or container ship, transmitted by messenger or fiber optic cable, preserved in memory or digital database, the essential message remains the same: that humanity flourishes when peoples connect, learn from each other, and work together toward shared prosperity and understanding. The road continues, as it always has, toward distant horizons, where new partnerships await, and ancient dreams of connection find fresh expression in each generation's efforts to build a more cooperative and prosperous world. Like silk threads woven into magnificent tapestries, the individual strands of human cooperation create patterns of beauty and strength that endure across centuries, connecting past and future in an endless journey toward greater understanding and shared abundance.